there's just no way really, given the evidence that was collected, that this was going to be easily sorted out. So, of course, they just asked themselves, who would want to harm Scott Macklem? This guy that all the teachers, everyone that he had worked for, whatever, had all said he's the smiling guy. He wants to lift the room up a bit, He's an athletic guy. He cares about his grades. He has his whole life in front of him. Who would want to take this guy down? Well, without naming any names, you could say, what if someone had it out for his family? I don't know. But all we do know is that the investigation went in a direction and it stayed in that direction once they got a name, once they got an actual name, not the alias. Once they got that actual name and they started putting together the stories from people that had known him, the things he had said, the things he claimed, it just sounded so fantastical.
That's Aaron Habel, the co-host of the Generation Y podcast and the true crime long-form series Framed. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. Aaron's returning this week to talk to me about the case of Temujin Kensu and the murder of Scott Macklem in 1986 in Port Huron, Michigan. Just to give you guys a little recap on what we discussed in the last episode, in November of 1986, a 20-year-old man named Scott Macklem was shot and killed in the parking lot of St. Clair County Community College in Port Huron, Michigan. Police quickly focused their attention on a former boyfriend of a woman he had briefly dated, a man known as Fred Freeman, who was living more than 400 miles away in Escanaba in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. At least 9 witnesses placed Freeman in Escanaba at the time of the murder. No physical evidence connected him to the scene. The prosecution's theory required, in some respects, some wild things to happen. And they even threw out the idea that he chartered a private plane, traveled to Port Huron, somehow landed somewhere and found a ride to the college's parking lot, committed the murder, and returned, all without a single trace of his presence. Aviation experts would later describe this theory in their words as so improbable, it is unbelievable. Freeman was nonetheless convicted of first-degree murder in 1989 and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He's since taken the name Temujin Kensu. He's maintained his innocence for more than 35 years. He's now 63 years old, in declining health, and still in the custody of the Michigan Department of Corrections. Aaron Habel is the co-host of Generation Y, and he's embarked on a contribution to the body of work on wrongful convictions and this case. Today, we're going to continue our discussion of the Macklem murder, the evidence that was and was not presented at trial, the prosecution theory that critics say should have never survived scrutiny, the 9 alibi witnesses the jury chose not to believe, the alternative suspects who were never seriously investigated, and what it would take legally, investigatively, and politically for justice to finally reach this case. In the first episode, part of what Aaron and I explored were some of the more interesting aspects of the case and Aaron's journey toward exploring it. We talked about how Aaron first heard about the Scott Macklem murder investigation. We also walked through what investigators knew in the immediate hours and days after Scott Macklem was shot. We also talked about the political pressure that was on investigators because Scott's father was the mayor of a nearby town. We also talked a little bit about how investigators began to focus on Freeman and Crystal Merrill, who had had some sort of relationship with Freeman before Macklem was murdered. We're going to pick it up where we left off, and let's get started. Yeah, and one of the interesting things I know when I had looked into the case, an argument has been made and often made that, Joplin years later, said that he had made up the story. But one of the interesting things that I had found out was that actually within months of telling the story, he had told a caseworker that that it wasn't true and that the prosecutor had promised to help him out from a jail perspective. But you sort of almost have to throw out someone like Joplin, because once you've told two different stories, let's just delete you from our equation. And then,
Well, that would be nice.
right. Well, and then sort of look at what's left. And that really comes down to an eyewitness who hadn't seen him before, someone who saw a plate but couldn't make a call on what that plate was. And then on the other side, you have these alibi witnesses that you had mentioned. And, one of the arguments about the alibi witnesses has been some of them sort of matter for the timeline. Some of them don't matter for the timeline, or in theory, somebody could have more easily made it. Which of the alibi witnesses do you think are the most important in terms of sort of credibility, and how do you assess their credibility? Things like, are they remembering the right day? Are they, was it really him they saw? How do you assess that?
Well, and this is where I get to say this perfect alibi, this solid alibi isn't so solid. And the reason is because we're bookending it on one side with Michelle saying that she was with him, in Rock in the morning when this shooting occurred. You could throw that out because Michelle did not testify. On the other hand, you have a woman named Kathleen Dyer who was at the karate school, and people have tried to discredit her, but she wasn't the biggest Frederick Freeman fan. She didn't probably like his attitude too much, but she had seen him that day, had talked to him, and she said when. And people try to say, well, maybe they didn't remember the day correctly, meaning her. Maybe Kathleen got the day wrong. This is something even a juror had said when trying to figure out, do they believe Renee Gobine more or Kathleen Dyer? They're literally saying that the person who knew what Freeman looked like, knew his name, was at a karate school with him, and knew that week that she hadn't shown up to the other day, because the other day of the week that she normally would have been there, because she wasn't there that week, on that day. So she was only there that day. And she's saying, I talked to him, I saw him that day. So in terms of trying to say, well, he wasn't really there, they misremembered, it all stems because Freeman seems, or Temujin seems to be the kind of person that wants to help himself immensely. And who wouldn't? But one thing he did was he contacted people and said, don't you remember I was there? Because the thing is he can tell you this whole story from front to back. He can tell you where he was at every moment. His mind is locked on this case over all these decades. But the thing is not everyone has his memory. Just look at the eyewitnesses. They couldn't agree on the color of the vehicle. So when it comes down to the witnesses who saw him at certain times, he was trying to make sure they could remember that it was him they saw that day and what they talked about and what was going on and the circumstances surrounding why they could vouch for him. That's building the perfect alibi. But the problem is when you do that, there are people who particularly don't care for this guy and will say you called them to plant memories in their brains.
Yeah.
You're getting them on your side, either through manipulation or because they figure they'll help you out. Like, oh, well, he seems certain. Because honestly, I can't remember exactly what I did a week ago on this day. I might know some things, but I mean, I may not.
Yeah, if you told me what I
had
had for breakfast this morning, I'd probably believe you before me.
Right. And that's the problem here. But this is a regular theme in this whole case, is that Frederick Freeman cannot help himself. Temujin Kensu cannot help himself.
Makes it look like he's trying to coach or manipulate the witnesses.
And so that may not be what he was doing either. We don't know. It could have been, or it might not have been. He's just a guy that always wants a say in what's going on. And if someone's like, well, we're going to have to go talk to these witnesses, he's like, I will help them remember because I was there and I talked to him and I know what we talked about. He probably remembers their conversations and who he talked to and how many people were there at any given. He probably remembers all that. That's the kind of brain this guy has. But for people that don't like him, they're going to go, oh, he's trying to put stuff in their brains or get them to have some mercy on him and stick up for him so he can beat this rap, you know.
And you'd think an attorney would tell you, please put down the phone. Don't talk to them. Let us talk to them, or let the police talk to them for that exact perception. But let's say we we buy into the argument that he was trying to manipulate them, and he's successful because he's Svengali, right? And what you would then do, right, is you would look to, okay, if he tried to manipulate them, and I was trying to figure out whether he was successful or whether I would look for corroborating evidence. And you said that example that she was normally there 2 days a week, but this week she was there on one day and it was a different day than the normal day. So it's sort of like it's a special day. So that's a bit of an anchor.
Yeah, I believe it was a Wednesday that she was there. And then, the other day, I think the other day was a Monday where she wasn't there, and there was a reason for it.
Yeah. And so she kind of can remember that day for reasons that, important reasons, and that lines up. And then wasn't there also a second person there who had an event that they remember from that day that they were going to afterwards and saw him as well?
Yeah, if I remember correctly, I think there was a man that had to go to a parent-teacher conference or something like that, and so he had to leave. He's another person. I mean, the thing here is why would these people lie? And then why would the eyewitnesses get it right? Because they don't honestly know who they're looking at, and they don't know the color of the car. They don't even know the make or model of the car.
Right. And people might argue fear or manipulation, but what you'd have a hard time making up were those corroborating events or those details. So basically you're in a situation where the juror is trying to decide, should I trust the eyewitness identification of someone who only saw him on that day versus
seconds.
versus a witness identification from someone who had seen him before. Were these people Temujin's friends, or are they people who got along with him really well or owed him money or something?
Not even close, because Temujin, or at least back then Frederick Freeman, he loved martial arts. That was his passion. I mean, if you talk to him now and you get him started, he will talk to you for hours, and he knows a lot. Now, these people knew him because he had been going to that school. He was thinking about joining that karate school. He was thinking about it. So it wasn't like he had been going there for months, I don't think. It was more like he had been trying it out. So these people had gotten to know him in a short time. But they at least knew him because they were in this karate school. There are lights everywhere and like, hello, who are you? And I'm, Frederick Freeman, whatever. This is far different than eyewitnesses who are like, I think that looks like the person I saw. But then one of them says that's James Loxton. But then in a different lineup says that's Frederick Freeman, when they point. And then the authorities will identify, well, that's Frederick Freeman or whatever. And then it's like they can't get their stories right, Right. And the thing is we've seen it in other cases. The most famous one might be the Ronald Cotton case, but where someone will look like someone else. They'll look like them. They'll have some similarities. So when you present someone with someone that looks similar, they're gonna say, well, this looks most like the person I saw.
Closest
that later
to
becomes
the
that's
person.
the person I saw.
Yeah. Well, and one of the problems in this case too is the photo lineup itself, because you've got, what was it, 4 pictures? And one of them looks completely not like the other, and that's his. And to me, that's just bad technique. You want, if I give you a lineup to identify a potential suspect, and one is like a new color picture and the others are like grayed out pictures from 1932, I think, it is an unsubtle message that I'm sending you, right?
Yeah, we would say that's not good protocol. Like, if you're going to do a true lineup, you need to make it to where they're going to find the detail that stood out to them that says, okay, this is the person. But in this case, even a couple of the people in the lineup were officers. They were police officers. And then, originally when they did this photo lineup, his photo looked completely different than the other ones.
Okay.
And so it's just one of those things, like you said, it's kind of like there might as well have been like a neon sign with an arrow going right down to his picture going, hey, look at this one,
Right.
you know? And it's not fair. And I don't know, like when you do that kind of thing in an investigation, it calls into question what you're actually going after. Because we do know that throughout history, we've had cases that weren't solved, they were closed. And there's a difference.
Yep.
And I'm not here to say that Freeman never did anything wrong. I'm here to say that, like, when you're going through this case and you're looking for evidence, that evidence isn't necessarily going to be anything that ties him to Macklem's murder. And so that's not to say that people can't have a different opinion than the people who are saying Freeman was wrongly convicted. But it's just, everyone's going to get to their answer the way they want to. But up front, I'm a big believer that you need to follow evidence. And if you find evidence and it's not matching your suspect, that's going to create a question. And if you don't stop and ask more questions at that point, all you're doing is getting tunnel vision and you're focusing on an individual who might not be responsible for the crime, no matter how much your story supports it.
And I think one of the things we have to learn, and I know I learned this in journalism, and I know investigators have to learn this too. We have to step away from our biases sometimes. I don't particularly like the man personally, having engaged and interacted with him. I would love for him to be guilty, in fact. But, the more I look into the case and the more I hear about the case, the more it's clear to me that despite how I may feel about him, certainly things seem to point in the opposite direction. But it does beg a question, right? Given all this evidence that sort of points away from him or points toward him being 400 plus miles away that day, what do you think led the jury to convict him? Because I know the current prosecutor, Mike Wendling, has suggested that jurors convicted him in part because they simply didn't believe the alibi witnesses. But I know it sounds like you and I have read some similar things that suggest that may not be exactly why they convicted him.
No, that factors in, they didn't believe Kathleen Dyer, which is interesting. Like I said, she knew him much better than any of the eyewitnesses. That they didn't know him. But all you have to do is read the articles from the time. I mean, the jurors kept pointing to the fact that Renee Gobine's testimony meant a lot. But Renee Gobine was also the one that said, I saw the plate, then that didn't work out. And then got hypnotized and came up with like 13 plates, and that didn't work either. Now, how the heck are we supposed to believe a person who got hypnotized over someone that knew him and was not friends with him? This is a big problem for me. I'm not saying you can't believe something different. It's just I just don't understand. It doesn't math for me. 1 and 1 equal 2. I don't get how people can say Renee Gobine's testimony was stronger than Kathleen Dyer's testimony.
Right.
It's very, very strange to me. And I've had other people tell me that, that the man who left to go to that conference or whatever, that even he was a better witness than Renee Gobine. But for whatever reason, the jury, I think, tend to side with the prosecution here because perhaps, and this is nothing they talked about, but I think it may have come down to they liked Cleland better than Dean. When you talk about the attorneys, I think
David Dean, Freeman's attorney.
The defense attorney. I think that they liked Cleland better. And also, they want to see this case solved.
Right.
And, when they were in the jury room and they were having to deliberate, I mean, the first vote, I think, was split. They had to take multiple votes to finally get down to where everyone agreed. And it was not easy. They had to debate. They had to talk about this. And this is something we'd have to talk about because, for a jury that's trying to get this right, they do not want a guilty person to walk. But, a lot of true crime followers, the people that read and take this stuff in every day, they're going to tell you it's better that 10 guilty people walked in to put one innocent person away. But
Right.
I don't know that the jury in 1987 was looking at it that way.
Or even just the fear of, if this guy is a murderer and we get this wrong, or we're on the fence and we let him go, that could have real consequences. I remember reading one of the articles. There weren't many interviews I saw afterwards, but one of the jurors was interviewed and said that Freeman's arrogance played a role in the decision making. And another juror said the alibi was too perfect, which I kind of find a little bit funny, because it would be one thing if I were providing you a too perfect alibi that was corroborated by my mother. But a too perfect alibi from some people who like me, some people who kind of really dislike me, some people who are on the fence about me. Um, you know, it it that kind of, I think, just even reading those two things, one, arrogance, which really has nothing to do with the crime, and then the too perfect alibi, sort of concerned me. But another thing that also concerned me, even if you buy the idea that Freeman committed the crime, you think he did it. His attorney, you brought up David Dean, had a serious cocaine addiction during the trial. There are a lot of things when you look at it. We were talking about the idea of Freeman reaching out to witnesses and how any sane attorney would have slapped that down, or at least tried to convince you not to do it. Um, it, it takes a lot to overturn a conviction, but I would think, if my attorney had an active cocaine addiction during the trial, was having all these different problems going on, that would even be enough, even if you believed he was guilty, to at least give him a new trial.
Yeah, there's a real question of what's fair. And I think the fair gets thrown out when the convicted is not well liked. And that's something that follows Temujin around because, if you go and meet him, I did go and meet him in person. He's very charming. He's an excellent conversationalist. He's a great storyteller. He's got a fantastic memory. And I know it's not perfect, but he's got a fantastic one. And he's very good at the details. But the thing is you can also picture that these jurors are not making it up when they said he's smirking and being arrogant at trial. That's believable. But the problem is that hurts him. And I don't know if he can realize that because that takes some objectivity. Maybe he can realize it. But the problem is there are literally people right now who could be listening to this episode of yours and saying, oh man, if I was a juror, I watched the guy whose life is on the line smirking and being arrogant during the trial, I'm not going to have a very positive feeling about him. And that's the kind of thing that can hurt you when someone's going, okay, I'm heading up to a fork in the road. I can go left, I can go right. And, maybe left, I can free him, or right, I'm going to say guilty. After seeing his behavior, it's like, you know what? Guilty.
But you
You
think
don't have to do any math. You don't have to add the evidence together. You don't have to have, how did he pull it off? How did he manage to get 400 some miles in such a short amount of time? We don't have to worry about that, So yeah, it's one of those things where he's his own worst enemy at times. And that's just going to keep following him because he has a personality and he's a big personality and it's not going to change overnight. And if it hasn't changed already, this is who we get. And this is why some people don't like him. Even with all his charm and intelligence and everything else, he's got people that don't like him just based on the fact of how he carries himself. They see arrogance.
Mm. And, but even in saying that, right? Like, one of the things, I could dislike someone or I could dislike the outcome, right? But there's a difference between whether I like the outcome and the actual facts, right? Because in theory, I could sit on a jury, look at the evidence, actually like the defendant, but still say, hey, I feel 95% sure of this person. did it. And, I think for me, I can reasonably separate those things. And I think jury instructions help you separate those things. But I also get the very human part of it, right? If you're on the fence or you're fearful or this person's sending you signals. But I think we need to learn to separate how we feel about things and what outcome would make us feel better from the idea of what's right and what's not right, if that makes sense.
Well, feelings are important. And I think we can look throughout history and, you picture the Macklem family sitting in the courtroom, seeing how this plays out, not knowing what the verdict's going to be. But for them, they're believing in the authorities that they got the right person. This verdict is very important to them, not because it's going to bring Scott back, but because they're looking for justice, some measure of justice to be able to say, you know what? We lost our loved one, but the authorities did a good job, captured the person, brought him to trial. And if they can get a conviction, it makes them feel a little better because the system cared about their loved one and they were doing the best they could with what they had. And I feel like the jury feels that too. I mean, if you're in a courtroom and you've sat through a whole trial where the prosecutor is laying out why this guy is so dangerous and evil, I mean, if you find him guilty, you're not doing anything too wrong because the guy's already a bad guy. This is why a judge has so much power in the courtroom. There were multiple things in this trial that could have been, not included. And then we could have a different outcome. Early on, it was a question, are we going to allow a rifle and a shotgun to be placed before the jury? Well, they weren't the murder weapons, right? I mean, there's no murder weapon in the courtroom. And of course, the defense is crying foul and saying, this is not fair. You're prejudicing our defendant. But, then the judge is like, well, as long as they know you're just trying to make it easy for an eyewitness to talk about a weapon they saw, then it's fine for that purpose. Or to say this was the type of weapon used in the crime, but it isn't necessarily the murder weapon. I mean, there are a lot of things here. And like you said, the whole character assassination stuff, again, it makes it so easy for a jury to just, if there's a lot of pressure, maybe you got two people left, it's 10-2 in the vote. That happened. What are those last two people thinking? They're in the minority now. They're not with everyone else. They're on the outside looking in and they're making everyone wait. There's real pressure in a jury room and under those circumstances. And if your defendant is unlikable, has been sneering, whatever, these kind of things can make all the difference.
It's kind of frightening if you think about it and thinking about that system. Well, let me throw out a thought for you, just in sort of thinking about this in general. I don't expect, any defendant or any person who's been convicted to be able to answer the question because they don't have the burden of proving who committed the crime. But if not Freeman, then who? Are there other viable suspects out there? Is that something that people are exploring or you're exploring or anyone is?
Well, I wasn't exploring that. I mean, for me, this wasn't about who did it. The question that I asked was, if this person's conviction is in doubt, then why are they still behind bars? I mean, when it comes down to it, we don't have other names. Are there names? Yes. There are other names. If you were to ask Temujin himself, he could probably give you some ideas. But the whole point here is those people weren't investigated like he was. This investigation was very narrowly focused on him. And so when I go out there and I say that Fred Freeman was their best suspect, it's only in the context of, well, they didn't really investigate anyone else. And they felt confident that this was a dangerous person. And they had the word of someone that knew him intimately that he was a dangerous person. And so they're just going off of that. Under those circumstances, he's the best suspect. But is he the actual person, the perpetrator? I feel like that's in doubt. I mean, there are things they could have tested. There are things they could have looked at. Maybe we would know more. But because those things aren't done, and I'm sure they'll say, well, we didn't have the money to do this, that, and the other thing. Well, you need to be careful about how you go about things because this is just someone's life on the line. And while they may not be fans of Frederick Freeman, the system needs to work. It needs to work. I know it's not going to work 100% of the time, but we should all at least be able to say, you know what? I don't agree with everything at the trial, but it seems like odds are they got the right person. In this case, they don't have the evidence tying him to the crime. They have an eyewitness who saw someone driving away. How do they even know that person was involved? And they'll say because, well, he threw his arm up or he was wearing, some sort of a hat that he had pulled down low. Well, whatever it is, that's not enough to tell me that this person even fired a shotgun. And even if they were, what if they just happened to look sort of like Frederick Freeman?
Right.
Because when you start talking about some white guy in his 20s, early 20s, and he's got some facial hair, how many people are we talking about here?
In 1980s Michigan, probably a lot.
Right. Right.
There've been
what? If you really look at history, there have been many people who have been wrongfully convicted and some of them put to death because they looked enough like the person seen.
Yeah. Too many. There have been appeals in the case. At one point, his conviction was overturned and set for a new trial. Then the Sixth Circuit Federal Court of Appeals then reversed that judge's decision. A special prosecutors looked into the case. Valerie Newman, she concluded there was no new evidence of innocence. But one of the interesting things in reading about it, Governor Gretchen Whitmer had called the case, quote, complicated, which to me is not exactly a ringing endorsement of the prosecution. And, I can kind of look at complicated in two different ways. And the first way is there's complexity in the case itself, right? That the evidence is complex, that the details are complex, they're competing theories. And that does not seem to be the case from what you're saying. And then the second piece, and this kind of ties back to something you were getting at before, there's complexity around the political calculus, right? And you've kind of alluded to the idea that Kensu just gets in his own way, that there's some things, there are people who don't like him, there's potential risk related to him. And I wonder whether, and I doubt she would answer the question, whether Whitmer was really getting at, is this really, I think, probably tough calculus for a politician, which is, maybe this person could be innocent, or maybe there's not enough evidence against them. Maybe I should commute this or whatever it may be, or give this person clemency, but they may also be dangerous too. So that idea being, I could have a dangerous person who is wrongfully convicted, and I'm being asked to use this clemency power. And the first responsibility for the governor is a lot different than the courts, where the court's responsibility is to this truth. The governor's responsibility is public safety, right? And I wonder whether the complexity is in Whitmer's head. I don't see a lot of evidence here, but I also don't see the political calculus that lets me let this person go. And I know it's not the way it's supposed to be, but I'm wondering whether that may be the reality.
Yeah, the reality is that there has been no clemency for Temujin Kensu. And all we have to do is look at how Whitmer has handled this whole thing. And I think it does come down to, it doesn't behoove her to grant clemency because there's no upside here. I think we've seen clemency given to people who are dangerous, who have pasts, who have proven crimes, unlike Freeman here, unlike Kensu. But there's usually a reason for that. Those people might have connections somewhere. The thing to note about Temujin is, despite the immense amount of support he seems to have, he doesn't have the support of the people in power. He has people who are former judges, former attorneys who have said, I believe in your case. I believe that you were wrongfully convicted. He's got some powerful people, but the people in power, they look at his case and they're like, I don't see how releasing him is going to do anything for me. In fact, probably will just harm me. And that's putting it mildly. I mean, there might be other reasons Whitmer wouldn't want to release him, but yeah, there's no upside here for Gretchen Whitmer to do anything with him.
Is there anything that, in going into this, is there anything or in the future that you could imagine that would convince you that he was in fact guilty?
Well, and that's the problem is when I dove into this case, one of the things that I did was I went and met with Temujin Kensu. And he was kind of surprised that I didn't ask him question after question about his case. I actually talked to him about his interests, and I wanted to get a feel for him. And the thing I told myself was, he's going to be charming. You know, I know that right from the get-go. So I didn't want to just accept everything. I went into this case looking for just whatever the truth would be. And I thought, surely if he's actually guilty, hopefully they can show me something that says he is, or at least could have been. And the problem really here is that Sergeant Bounds wasn't fit to do a case like this.
It's a lead
The guy that
investigator.
normally would be there running this case was out at the time. And so they had Bounds running the investigation, and there are lots of problems with this investigation. I mean, this is just my perception of it, but it definitely feels like they were trying to make things match Freeman, aka Kensu, rather than just following the evidence. And that's a dangerous thing, because if that's your goal, there are ways to do that. There are ways that you can just work yourself into a corner and say, well, this is our only option. And I would argue this case, it wasn't like it was a stabbing. This was a shooting. And there's just no way really, given the evidence that was collected, that this was going to be easily sorted out. So, of course, they just asked themselves, who would want to harm Scott Macklem? This guy that all the teachers, everyone that he had worked for, whatever, had all said he's the smiling guy. He wants to lift the room up a bit, you know? He's an athletic guy. He cares about his grades. He has his whole life in front of him. Who would want to take this guy down? Well, you know, without naming any names, you could say, what if someone had it out for his family? I don't know. But all we do know is that the investigation went in a direction, and it stayed in that direction once they got a name, once they got an actual name, not the alias. Once they got that actual name and they started putting together the stories from people that had known him, the things he had said, the things he claimed, it just sounded so fantastical. It's like, who else would it be? You know? Obviously, when we look at Robert Cleland, what did he do that was effective in the trial? Well, sure. He did a lot of character assassination, which I frankly don't feel is relevant. If you have something that ties him to the crime, let's hear about it. Oh, you couldn't find a shotgun that he owned? The most they could say was someone one time touched a bag and thought a shotgun could have been in that bag. But this is a guy that had lots of martial arts weapons, right? So when it came down to it, what they're trying to do is they're trying to say this is a bad guy. He had to have done it. And Cleland used the theory that the reason why Scott Macklem had to die was not only that he claimed or alleged that Freeman had threatened Scott's life, but he was saying that he wanted to be back with Crystal Merrill, and that if she got married, he wouldn't be able to. So he had to take out her love, and then he could get his way back in and get a hold of her again. But that was his theory.
It's an interesting piece of it. From my perspective, have any of the investigators or prosecutors or jurors or Scott's family, have any of them spoken about it since?
Well, I know that in the time after the trial ended, there was some communication with the media. And, just the word is they all believed that Freeman was guilty. And they had hoped for a guilty verdict. So when the verdict was read, there was a sort of a sense of relief. Again, there was this idea that any of the problems going on at the time with Crystal Merrill and Scott Macklem, it was believed that Freeman was behind that. And so he became the boogeyman. And so they trusted the authorities. They trusted the trial. But no matter where you fall in this case, really think about it. How much evidence do you need? If it's just an eyewitness who'd never seen that person before, and then you have a story that the suspect is guilty of all these crazy things like stalking and claiming to read minds and teleporting and is some ninja warrior, so they're dangerous. I mean, you have to ask yourself, they built this guy up to be this dangerous ninja warrior with poison darts, in his shoes, but Scott Macklem was killed with a shotgun. And if you're Temujin Kensu, Fred Freeman, there are probably other ways you could kill someone, especially if you're a ninja. I mean, my thought is, why didn't he do it where no one was around?
Right. It's not it's interesting because the school parking lot is not the place you would pick. Even if you were, pick a private place, pick near someone's house, it's just an odd place to pick for a murder like that, which then begs, just some natural questions for you to explore. Sort of stepping back a little bit, Aaron, I'm curious from your perspective. I'm curious in general about what's gotten you into the space, but I'm curious from your perspective, what you sort of on a personal level are hoping to accomplish by covering the case now that you've gotten to the point where you're ready to release the series.
Yeah, so I think it would be a misconception to say that I'm going to be this special advocate for Temujin Kensu. What I would like to say is, as a person who really lives this life where I'm constantly analyzing cases and looking at the system, how it works, my whole point of this is just to make people think when you're going to say someone's guilty. And I've done this myself in the past. What's the bar you have to clear? If it's just that it's a good story because you feel like he would have had a motive, and even though you don't know how he would have pulled it off, he had to have done it, that's honestly not good enough. We need to have a higher bar, because anytime we start giving concessions to authorities to take shortcuts, we're now making the system easier to harm people. And I know you're going to say, well, they're not coming after me. Well, good for you. But, if we're going to have a just society, if we want to sleep well at night, we need to try a little harder than this. That would be my point. There's a lot that I cover over the episodes. There will be 8 episodes. There'll be some supplemental episodes where I do additional discussions with people in the industry. I really feel like this is just a great case to talk about things about what's important and how we decide whether someone's truly guilty.
Right.
And I just wish people could put themselves in a different pair of shoes and ask if, an eyewitness is enough to say you're guilty of a crime. I mean, it's lucky for you that you're not going to be going to prison, that you're not going to be fingered for a crime like this, right? Or at least you think. But we know throughout time that it has happened to people. There are people that have gone to prison that were convicted and later cleared because DNA was finally tested,
right,
or what have you.
And we have a litany of cases throughout our history in America of this happening, right? Either because of shortcuts or because of presumptions about certain things or because of someone's race or pick what factor, counterculture, you're somehow different than other people. And I don't think it's always malicious, but I think sometimes people just don't want to give you the benefit of the doubt or don't give you the benefit of the doubt. But one of the things in listening to what you're saying, what I kind of hear is the case itself is important to you, but the really important part is being able to shed a light on how things like this can happen and what kinds of things we need to be thinking about as citizens, whether we're in the position of being a judge or juror or anyone else, the things we need to be thinking about, those unconscious biases that we may have, or what is good evidence and what isn't. Those are the kinds of big picture things you're hoping people can pull away from this. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to think that people can set aside their feelings about this individual that was convicted and just look at the case and ask if they were at the center of the case, would this be enough to convict them? I wish that was something people could do. I don't know if it's possible. But I think too often we're looking for a side and we're trying to ask, well, am I on this side or am I on that side? We should just be asking, is this system working? And asking, if this case were tried in 2022 instead of 1987, how would it have gone? Because I can tell you right now, there would not be this reliance on eyewitnesses the way it was back then. That has been thoroughly debunked as a real thing. Now, maybe if someone had seen the person before, had some familiarity with them, they could talk to that. They could speak on that. But if it's someone they'd never seen before and they're kind of obscured anyway, given how they're driving or their arm being up or a hat being pulled down low, that's just not a recipe for a legitimate trial, in my opinion. And I know a lot of attorneys will say, well, if they got a conviction, it stands, that's it. That's our system. I wouldn't be proud of that.
Yeah. And I see their argument, right? There's a reason you brought up Scott's family, and there's a reason why we want victims and their loved ones to feel some sense of finality. And I think it really is important for them to be able to close a book. But at the same time, if we want to live in a truly just society, that can't come at the expense of, a reasonable doubt, right? A reasonable doubt that someone committed a crime.
Yeah. And I think, a lot of times these things become political. And I would say perhaps one of the most brilliant moves that happened during this trial was by the prosecution saying that the alibi was too perfect. Because, if you ask someone, well, if you checked into the suspect and they have an alibi, perhaps they checked into work and there are cameras everywhere and they interacted with their fellow employees that day and the boss saw them and they don't even get along with their boss. And, there's all this stuff backing up that they weren't there. We could say, well, that proves they weren't there. And so we have to keep looking. But in this case, they basically turned a strength into a weakness and said, it's too perfect.
A crazy strategy, by the way.
But hey, if you're trying to win a case, sometimes you have to turn the crazy on, right? And try things.
Right.
Because look, if they had a fingerprint matching him, they would have used that. They would have led with that. We know that he did this crime because his thumbprint is, but they didn't have that.
What do you think it would take for him to get out?
I have no idea. Again, I'm not sitting here talking with you trying to push that he get out. I guess my point is that I don't know how they ever got the conviction in the first place legitimately. I see the comments from the jurors. I know what kind of case was mounted against him. I've seen all the trial transcripts. I've read through them all multiple times, like at least twice. And, they did a great job of saying, here's a dangerous person. He harmed a lot of people and he had it out for Scott, et cetera, et cetera. But, again, I look at this and I think we have to be able to match things up. We have to be able to follow the leads and the evidence. And it seems like in this case, a lot of people have settled on, well, they showed he had a motive and he's really smart. So he did it in a way that they can't really explain, but we believe they got the right guy because he was seen there. But again, someone who, you have 3 eyewitnesses who all said they saw this person and 2 of them couldn't consistently pick him out. And the one who did, well, they went and saw they saw a professor who hypnotized them. And I don't know how all that adds up to guilty, but that is our system. It makes mistakes, or it does things that we can't really understand. So I guess that's what we're left with, is the system doesn't always work. And I think raising the bar would be a good thing.
Right.
I am haunted by people who have served any time at all. And I've gotten to know some of these people, and there's always some reason why people felt justified convicting them or aiding in convicting them. And that's even after it's proven these people had nothing to do with the crime. But it bothers me. I don't think we should just say, I don't like this person, so I'm good with them going away. I don't believe karma should lead the way when it comes to these trials. And I get that there are people that knew him that will yell to the rooftops like, he's a terrible guy. Okay. That wasn't the question here. The question was, who killed Scott Macklem and why? And I think if they had proved it, I'd believe it.
Right. So, quick question for you, just in general, as we're wrapping up. How many years in podcasting is this for you now?
Well, now this year is 14 years.
14 years in podcasting and hundreds of episodes during that time. What keeps you going?
Oh, these stories, I think I've had people ask me, like, what is it about true crime? Why are so many people interested in it? Why are you interested in it? These are human interest stories. What happens to one person can happen to all of us, whether it's a young lady walking to her car that's in a garage, one of those public garages, and, is there someone stalking her? Someone was murdered in their home, and who did it? Was it the husband? Oh, wait, maybe he was at work. Or was he? I mean, we all want to be able to navigate this life, our world, and get through. We all dream of making it to old age and saying, I made it. The world's full of danger. And I think the more we understand how these things happen and where they can go and how investigations work, they sort of hit us in different ways. When we find out someone was wrongly convicted and then we find out they get out and maybe they get millions of dollars to help compensate their lost life, it's like, wow, maybe there's some justice in the world. Maybe if they finally find the perpetrator of a crime that happened 32 years ago because of some DNA that was finally tested, we finally have the technology to get that DNA tested the way it needed to be tested. Now we can go to that person's door, knock on it, and say, hi. They can close that case, and it's like, wow, justice is never out of the question. But it's like, also, just how do you navigate life? I mean, how do we protect ourselves? How do we help people? I've talked to people whose kids have gone missing. You have David Robinson out there. His son Daniel Robinson, who was a geologist, went missing, and he has worked night and day for years to try and solve that case. And it's not to say the investigators didn't do it. They try. It didn't work, but his father's not giving up. And I told him, I said, you could write a whole book now on what families should do when their loved one goes missing. And it's not because he closed his son's case. It's not because he found him, but now he knows how to build resources. He knows how to get people on your side. He knows how to talk about things. He knows who to reach out to. We're all learning, man. And all this stuff, if we care, if we have empathy, we start getting into it. And I believe there are people with empathy that are on the other side of this case that we discussed all night long. I mean, I think there are people that believe Freeman's guilty as hell and do care. They do care. They may not see things the way we do, but they do care. They just probably care more about the Macklem family and about the Merrills, But we're all trying our best. And so, by having these discussions and talking about what's important, we got to keep the dialogue open.
Yeah. Yeah. Keeping the conversation going, I think, is one of the most important things to do. So we can talk. And I love that thing that you said about these aren't true crime stories. They're human stories. I often say there are no black stories, no white stories. I think I'm going to add no true crime stories. They're just human stories. And, it's every time we explore these things, every time we look behind the curtain, there are things that we can all relate to, whether you put yourself in Freeman's shoes or in Crystal Merrill's shoes here, or whether you put yourself in the juror's shoes or any of these different things. They're things that we can learn about ourselves and build our self-awareness, and our self-awareness really helps us be better people and contribute to society in a deeper way. You mentioned someone like the Daniel Robinson case. It's tragic and it's sad. Or you think of somebody like Julie Murray, the sister of Maura Murray, who went missing in New Hampshire. It is, but one of the, I think, beauties of what so many people do in these situations, and sometimes they do it publicly and sometimes they do it privately, they take their pain, their experience, and they turn it into something good. And I suspect all of us who are out here doing these things, there's probably something in our history, so something in our past that, whether people know it or not, we're turning it into some good. And I'm glad you're doing this, and I'm glad you still seem energized by the enterprise, because I really do think these human stories do matter and have a deep impact. So thanks for coming on to talk about it.
Yeah, I really appreciate you inviting me. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. And hopefully our talk has led people to just consider things. Again, I know we can't always change everyone's minds all the time, but it's just those discussions. And I know I've learned a lot from discussing this case and other cases from other people, even if it doesn't change my entire mind. I have come to some understanding of certain things. And as long as we keep that dialogue open, I think we can all benefit.
Yeah. And the real trick is, I think in many ways, it's not personal. It's all about learning from each other. And there have been many times where I've learned from people I disagree with. And I think I learn more from people I disagree with. So thanks, Aaron, and good luck with everything, and talk to you soon.
Been a pleasure. Thank you, Jason.
Thanks for joining us for these 2 episodes on the criminal justice system. I really appreciated having you here, Aaron. For the rest of you, if you'd like to join us and other listeners for more discussions, we can be found on most social media platforms, a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations and early and ad-free episodes, you can join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. In the meantime, thank you again for joining us. I'm Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you guys all again soon.